Yes, I can see it. Thank you. Mhm.
Excellent. Okay, to
Yes.
get my timer started. Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. I am super excited to share the progress that we've made in the second year of the Landlord Mapper initiative. So, yes, without further ado, my name is Dylan. I'm the creator of Landlord Mapper. I gave a presentation at Shy Hack Night just about exactly a year ago, and this presentation will be a report back on the progress that we've made in the last year and where we're headed. So, yes, this presentation, I'll give a very brief, try to be brief, introduction and background as to who I am, what this project is, why it exists. I will talk about all of the work that we've been doing in the past year, specifically advancements in the methodology, standardizing the data model, the rewrite, adding new cities, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, I'll squeeze in a live demo to talk about some changes that we've made to show and demonstrate to everybody what's changed, what's the same in Landlord Mapper. And then we'll do the Q&A. So really briefly, I talked about this a lot in the presentation I did last year, so I won't go too much into it this time, but who am I and why am I doing this? I studied international relations, was going to be a Spanish teacher, but in 2022 changed my career, started to learn how to code. And I had also in the past volunteered as a tenant organizer to just assist with campaigns. I was never doing it full time. I was never doing it super intensely, but I did volunteer on some campaigns and I learned a little bit about the dynamic between landlords and tenants. And then also had some experiences, some not super pleasant experiences with landlords myself, and sort of became aware of this issue. But there was a specific experience I had when I was living in the great city of Los Angeles, which is pictured Venice Beach, beautiful trees. Um, I was renting. This was actually right at the time when I was starting to learn how to code, funny enough. But I was renting, and the landlord would make up fake names in emails with tenants. And so it was him and his wife, a husband and wife landlord couple, and they seemed to be intentionally trying to make it difficult for their tenants to know who they were, like making up names and emails. And I had a lot of tenants send me emails, and so there were tons of different names. None of these people existed. And so I thought, wow, that's kind of wild. And so eventually I wanted to try to organize a tenant union, and I wanted to find other properties that these landlords owned. And I noticed that the man or the husband in the husband and wife couple would use different last names on his property taxes. And I saw that and I thought, how could that be legal? But also, how is it legal that they're just making up names with tenants? And all of this seems to be to really conveniently allow them to stay hidden from their tenants. And of course, eventually, I tried to organize a tenant union. A lot of stuff happened, but the landlord ended up filing fake police reports in my name. So I started getting calls and texts from the LAPD to follow up about reports that I never made. And so of course, I at that point said it was not worth it. Will not be continuing my organizing of this specific building and landlord, but this just gets at a broader sort of the bigger picture of why this initiative is important because there is a ton of criminal landlord. There are a ton of criminal landlords out there, and they have mostly complete impunity, not just to harass and intimidate organizers, but just plain old fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement, et cetera, et cetera. This is everywhere. This is happening all over America, all the time, in every city. And it's really difficult to wrap your head around it and comprehend just the scale of it. But I sort of had this experience coming up against that and realized that if you don't know who your landlord is, you cannot sue them. If you do not have a name or an address to serve a lawsuit notice, you can't sue them. So, what that means practically is that if a landlord hides their identity from a tenant, they are essentially stripping their tenants of their rights. Because if you have rights on paper, LA has great tenants' rights as far as America goes. But if you can't assert them in court because you don't know who your landlord is, those rights are basically stripped from you. So that's the background of sort of why this project exists and why I think it's important to access information about who your landlord is. So real quick, I'll run through this timeline of progress that the project has made so far. We broke ground in June 2024, and we initially started with Milwaukee, Landlord Mapper Milwaukee, because there was a similar project where the authors had published their data set, and I wanted to just sort of create a, because you call it a beta version or just a sort of a test to see what we could do and what the possibilities could be with this kind of project. And so for the next 6, 7 months after that, we built Landlord Mapper Chicago, and we built our own methodology to link the property taxpayer records to the business filings, which I'll talk about a lot. We launched in January 2025. We launched Landlord Mapper Chicago, and then right afterwards was the first Shy Hack Night presentation. So a year ago, when we did that presentation, that was sort of the culmination of this initial effort to get the data and to build out the initial UI and the front facing user site for the methodology that underlies it. Fast forward a few months, we get a contract with the University of Minnesota to basically build a website really similar to Landlord Mapper, but for Minneapolis, for the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. And so this was a great opportunity to try to get the methodology working for a different city. So that was a really valuable experience. We'll talk about more in a bit. Fast forward 5 months later, we get our first grant. Took a very, very long time. It was very difficult, but we finally were awarded a grant by the Nathan Cummings Foundation to expand Landlord Mapper to 5 new cities. And so throughout that time, all the way up until just this past January, so almost an entire year, I rewrote the entire application so that it could scale up so that we can add new cities, add new features, and scale up a lot more quickly because the first version of the site was built strictly for Chicago's data. And so we wanted to standardize that data model. So I rewrote the application. It took a very long time, but once it was done, we were able to add new cities very quickly. So Raleigh and Charlotte, we launched those just a couple weeks after the rewrite was done. Nashville, we launched a couple weeks later. And then this coming week, in the next 7 days, we'll be launching Landlord Mapper St. Louis and Kansas City. So that's just a brief rundown of the timeline, sort of where we're at right now, how we got here. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly changed. What sort of work did we do? How did the methodology specifically change? And these are just some of the biggest points I'll go over. And then from there, we'll go on to talk about the rewrite and the data model standardization. So methodology, real quick. The most important concept to understand here is the idea of the network data structure. So these are nodes and edges. Whoops. These are the names and the addresses that are linked together. You can see that there in this graph. This is the core of the methodology that allows us to view these networks of property ownership. And to try to demonstrate how the network functions and how we use it in the code, I just have this graph here and I'll go through these. So imagine we're looping through a list of taxpayer records. So taxpayer names and addresses. We get the first one, Larry Jones, 392 Atlantic Ave. We can associate this name and address now. We can assume that they are related. And so property might have this taxpayer record. We go to the next taxpayer record and we see a different name, John Smith, but the same address. And so now any property that has any of these two taxpayer records, we can assume that that is part of the same portfolio, or at the very least, that they are associated. If we continue looping through taxpayer records, we might come across an LLC or a shell company that the landlord uses to own the property, and they might have a matching address with John Smith and Larry Jones. So now that business filing record is connected to the owner network. We can keep going and we can take the party names. And so a party to a business entity is just like the registered agent, the president, the chairperson, any individual or company that is a party to a business filing can also be added to the network graph and used to grow it. And so if there's a different address attached to a business filing, for example, we can add that also to the network. And we can just keep going and going and going. And so this is the network. This is what we mean when we say network. And so when you see the property data in Landlord Mapper for the networks, that's all data associated with all of the properties associated and aggregated for all of the properties that fall within this network. And so that's what you're seeing when you search for a property and you see all the names and addresses in Landlord Mapper. And so what happens if an address is a registered agent's office? What happens if an address is a law firm or if it's not the true owner? That's probably the biggest problem that we attempt to solve in the methodology is that how do you know which names and addresses to leave out? How do you know if you include John Smith, what about all the John Smiths in the world? And so that's the key problem in this type of work is to figure out how to model the data to be able to explore all of the connections without making too many false positives. So one way that we attempted to do this, the research entity, this is the analog research of the most frequently appearing names and addresses in the data. So once we run the network, we can get a list of the most frequently appearing addresses and we Google them and we search them in Google Maps and we poke around a bit and we see whatever comes up. We it might be a business, it might be a property management company, it might be a law firm, and then we can mark it to either be included or excluded from the network graph. There's a lot of addresses to exclude. However, it's still really important to be able to see these connections and differentiate between them. And so when you go to Landlord Mapper and you look at the homepage, you'll see these top portfolios on each of the city's homepage. The research entity is an organization that is found to be associated with a specific validated address. Many times these addresses are the property management companies. And so I'm really interested in this in the data of being able to distinguish between the property manager and the true owner. Because many times the property management company is not the true owner, it's a different person. The true landlord might be contracting out their services to a property management company, but we still need to know that. And it would still be useful to distinguish between that. So that's what a research entity is. The first time we did this methodology, there were some limitations and some drawbacks to how we did it. The lack of address granularity, I'll talk about that in a second, limits the matching. Excluding party names. The first time we did not include the party names in the network graphs, only the addresses. And also, we only matched the business entities based on the names, like the taxpayer names, as opposed to the addresses. And so there's so many other matches that could be out there. And so this next time around, we changed it up a little bit to be able to see those. So the first thing, big lesson from Minneapolis, directionals. 123 South Oak Street versus 123 Oak Street South. The South right there, there's the pre-directional comes before the street name, post-directional comes after. What happens if they put down the pre-directional as a post-directional? Or what if they leave out the directional completely? It might seem like a really inconsequential clerical error, but that has huge consequences for the network matching. And so in Minneapolis specifically, there's lots of streets that have directionals that are incorrectly placed or missing. And so I thought, how can we link these properties or these taxpayer records, even if the directional is missing or misplaced? And the solution we came up for that is versioning the address. So if we run the network matcher and we use different versions of the address, so excluding the unit number or the directionals or some combination of both, obviously the networks get really big and there's a lot greater chance of false positives, but it also reveals a lot of very interesting connections that could be useful for investigating. So that was one thing we changed. With Minneapolis, Minneapolis has a rental registry. And so the city requires landlords to submit their name, phone number, email, and address. And so this is another data source we can use to build the networks. Normally we just for Chicago, we just use taxpayer records and business filings. For Minneapolis, taxpayer records, business filings, and rental licenses that whose names and addresses we use to build the networks. So having this, then, if you look at the numbers, when you include the rental license and the network generators, you see less networks, which means the networks are bigger, which means more connections. So this in the future, then we could take the methodology and we can add, if we want to add, for example, the data from the recorder of deeds, then we could build that in and use the recorder of deeds names and addresses to build the network. So the methodology we built tries to allow for that kind of expansion in the future. Then there's the party names. So this is one thing that I think is the single most interesting part about this entire project, in my opinion. If you do include the party names in the network graphs, you can then look at the most frequently appearing names in the networks and then in the whole data set. And the kind of things that you find when you Google these names is incredibly interesting. Keep in mind, for these names, we have every registered business and mailing address associated with all of these people in the articles that you're about to see. So I'm just going to read a few of these out loud. And these articles just come up when you Google the names. It took no effort at all to find these. Illinois Supreme Court suspends attorney Michael A. Abramson amid federal tax fraud and witness tampering charges. Investors nationwide say they lost money in alleged housing scheme involving Chicago homes. And you can see the people whose names I searched to find these articles right here. Steve Raymond. Feds sell convicted Raleigh CEO's farm for $3.8 million as Ponzi scheme victims wait to get their money back. That was for Stephen Peters. Lawsuit charging private equity owned nursing home harmed residents crawls forward. Local attorney sentenced to prison for embezzlement. Attorney John Hansel has been disbarred. And then the last one, my favorite. Why this one Delaware address shows up 108 times in the Epstein files. Of course, this address is a registered agent, so the minute you look into it, you realize there's no connection with the people and these data necessarily with the Epstein files. What is particularly interesting, though, about this is that these connections between the names and the business records and the properties could uncover some extremely interesting things about corrupt people and about criminals, white collar criminals. And I just think that's so interesting. And it really makes you realize the power that this kind of project has, and not the methodology that we use specifically, any of these. There are a lot of researchers in this space that are developing these methodologies precisely to be able to uncover these connections. And so it's just really, really interesting to be able to see that and to be able to find this kind of stuff when you search it. We've standardized the data model. This part might be the most important result of all of our efforts in the past year. We have built this data model to work with any city, so long as the raw data includes specific columns. And so now when we go to add a city, 85% of the code, probably more like 95% of the code to get the landlord network data output is already written. The only thing we need to do to add a new city is transform the raw data just a little bit at the very beginning to pass the validation. And so we have a system now of validation schemas to basically check every data set at every step of the way to make sure it has all the columns it needs, to make sure the column names match what the processor expects, and to make sure there's no missing values in the required columns. And also for each city, we need to have custom rental subset logic because that also changes. But other than those two things, we've totally standardized this process across the board. And so then that gets to the rewrite. Why did I rewrite the entire application? Because the first time it only worked for Chicago. And we've had, since the beginning, our sights set on expanding to other cities and to eventually expand across the whole country. But rewriting the application, it took a long time, but now it's scalable. So the front end, back end, data processor, it's all standardized to scale. So we can now add new cities a lot faster. And with that, I will go ahead now and show you all what the site looks like. This is landlordmapper.org. So now we redesigned the homepage a little bit. Now each city has its own city specific homepage. And then if you want to go back and you can flip between them, but it's all standardized. All of the data, the underlying data model, the different database tables, all of it is standardized. And so if we go into Chicago here, you can see this list of top portfolios. And just to explain what you're looking at here, you'll notice that they have these weird names. These are just the most frequently appearing taxpayer names in a single network. And so that's how the names of the networks, that's why they look like that. And then you'll see these taxpayers and entity filings right here. And some of these you'll see the names of actual people. That's because for each network, there are a list of taxpayer names and addresses for all the properties that fall within that single network. And the most frequently appearing names in all of those taxpayer records within a network is what you see when you scroll through the list. You see Donald Trump Jr. right here. That's kind of crazy. Um, but you can also then switch to entities. So remember the entities, the research entities, these are the property management companies and the government agencies. And these are the properties that whose taxpayer address matches one specific validated address that we searched and determined that was associated with one of these companies. So if you look, then let's just go to Kagan. And we have redesigned, actually, we'll go to a network first because it's better to see the network. Love going to first property I ever lived in Chicago to demonstrate. Shout out to Yelena, my old landlord. So you can see here, we redid the UI, tried to get the most important information out front and sort of visually in the visual hierarchy more prominent. Which before we had the full page map view and then the data panels, and it was a little distracting. But you go here and you see the data about a property. You can scroll through and see basically the same data that was there before, just the layout's slightly different. If you look at the portfolio, this is where you can explore the network. So all of the names and addresses that were matched to get this data you can view it on the side panel here. Key names and addresses. These are just the most frequently appearing names and addresses in the network. So these will not always, this was my landlord, Yelena. Not all of these people, not all of these addresses will be the true owner of the property. However, if you go to the assessor's site and you find out that your landlord is an LLC whose address is the Chicago Title and Land Trust Company office, the network might help you out a little bit to try to find the correct and real address to be able to send correspondence to your landlord. So that's the purpose of that. And then, of course, you scroll down and see all the data that was there before about the code violations and then the registered business entities associated with the taxpayer records that were matched. Still have the full page map view. It just exists right here by itself, and so you can still look at that. And then also on the home page, I really like the just pretty colors, and so I wanted to add the polygon layers for the wards, and then those were there before, but now you have also the neighborhoods and the commissioner districts for Cook County. So you can go and look at that, look at the different different geographies that in theory one day you could see the landlord data for. That would be interesting. Also the neighborhoods here, this comes from the city of Chicago's data portal. So if any of these neighborhood boundaries are controversial, please direct your questions to the Chicago City of Chicago data portal for making them. And yeah, I could go on, but this is the update. This is what the site looks like now. And for each of these cities, you can go in and look at that. So Nashville has the same thing. Milwaukee, not every city has the neighborhoods because the data is not as available. Milwaukee has a crazy amount of neighborhoods given its size, but it's just interesting to see. So, okay, we're at 24 minutes. Great. So what's next? Where's the what's next? We are trying to automate the data processing workflows in with this technology called temporal. And it's basically workflow automation technology that we're trying to get all of the data to be processed and uploaded in the cloud so that we can automate the updates to the data since the data is changing all the time, properties bought and sold all the time. So this is a really important aspect. Once we get that up, once we get the data infrastructure up into temporal, we will have this repository of property and owner network data that we could do some really cool, exciting stuff with. So that's the biggest priority right now for us. We'd also like to create some sort of agentic workflow for the analog research. A lot of the analog research is time consuming and meticulous. Companies, law firms, property management companies are constantly changing their address. And so, how do you figure out which addresses to exclude? And how do you categorize these different addresses? We think that's a great use case for an agentic workflows in the future. We'd like to be able to automate that, would help us scale a lot quicker. And we're trying to expand to new cities. There's so many cities out there that have their data published in an acceptable way, such that Landlord Mapper can use it to get the data really quickly. So that's what we're looking at going forward. And now I think we are ready to wrap up the presentation, go on to Q&A. If you would like to stay informed about the progress that we're making and learn about any new features and new cities, I'll go ahead and put this in the chat. You can subscribe to the Substack that we have now. We're just got a newsletter in the past few months up, and I'll go ahead and put that link in the chat. And so I think that will be it for the presentation. Ready for Q&A?
So thank you. It was it was really nice to hear the update. I was excited when I saw that you were back on the schedule again. So I have one question here, and I have a few other questions over here. There's one question here. Ryan is asking, who pays for this? You're like, that's a great question.
That is, could you be more specific about what this means?
Yeah, Ryan, are you there?
Yeah, I can come offline.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So I actually work with the City of Chicago, the Department of Planning and Development. And so I'm just curious, as you think to expand, like, I know it's an algorithm that you all are trying to, I guess, create to kind of automate if you have the data set to just, expand that way. But are you all just deploying it as you all have the data, or are you all charging cities to use this, or what does that look like as you expand?
That's a great question. That's TBD. So right now we're really thinking critically now that we're reaching this point in the project about how to build financial sustainability for the project. So we're thinking about different kinds of products or tools that we can create that will allow us to sort of bring in income or things that could solve specific problems that a lot of times city officials or workers in like the buildings department for a city that could be useful for them. And so that's a great question. We're still working on it. We think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of different things we can make, but right now we're sort of trying to wrap up the contractual obligations that we have with the foundation and the University of Minnesota, but definitely stay tuned because we'll be figuring that out shortly, or we need to figure that out shortly.
Here are some other questions. Oh, what is it? Do you find that some of the landlords are operating in multiple cities? Is that common, or are most of them, not only the landlords, but the entities, are they usually city specific, or do you find that they'll work across multiple cities?
That's an interesting question because so many of the private equity companies that are buying up property and land operate on a national level. So I think
Oh,
the Tenant Union Federation is trying to organize around a national portfolio right now, where they have been. And what's really interesting about the data in the South, so Raleigh, Charlotte, Nashville specifically, you'll find a lot more of these like national level private equity companies that you do see the same companies over and over again in the data. But in a lot of the older Midwestern cities or the old Rust Belt cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis specifically, there's a lot less of the private equity and a lot more of the shady law firms and a lot more of the what I think could be sort of the older landlords that are more city or region specific that you really can't find because they're so well hidden. One interesting note about Chicago specifically is two things. One, with the Chicago Title and Land Trust Company, I have never of all these cities, I haven't seen any of them that use trusts to hold their properties like Chicago does. If you a trust is basically party A entrusts party B to hold an asset for them. Party A maintains ownership legally and is the primary beneficiary of that asset, but party B is the owner on paper. So if you're a landlord, you if you have enough money, you can totally hide your identity completely. It's expensive, and so not all a lot of landlords are cheap, so they won't do that, but the biggest ones will do that. And so in Chicago, the most frequently appearing names and addresses are the Chicago Title and Land Trust Company. And Chicago, also with Cook County is not allowed to verify that an LLC exists when a new property deed is processed. So I think Chicago is exceptional in the kind of corruption that is allowed to happen, specifically when it comes to properties. It is exceptional. And from all the cities that I've dealt with in the data, and also from like tenant organizers and people who work with cities that I've spoken to since doing this, that Chicago is exceptionally corrupt in that aspect. But um, yeah, I hope that answers the question. It's highly variable, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah. So that goes, I guess that kind of goes into another question here. Like you were saying that they were using different names. Like, I guess, do they not have to show proof of IDs? For example, when they get their rental license in Milwaukee, can they just put anybody's name on that? Like how are they using these multiple names? And maybe it comes back into what you were saying before, that it just costs money. Are these names that they're using actually legitimate names, or are they just making them up?
For the taxpayer records, you mean?
Well, the taxpayer record, the address, and then also in Milwaukee, they had the rental license.
Yeah, or in Minneapolis.
I mean, Minneapolis, sorry, Minneapolis. Sorry, I
Yeah,
have maps in front of me. Okay, yeah.
no, you're good. Yeah, most of the properties, most big landlords will just incorporate an LLC for each property. And so it's really common to see like the address of the building. If you go to look at your landlord on the county assessor's site, and you'll see 2400 North Clark LLC. A lot of landlords will do that. There was one landlord in Milwaukee that apparently he just made up LLC names that all started with A, like A LLC, so that he's always alphabetically on the eviction court docket. He always goes first because all of his LLCs start with A, and that was the reason why he did that, which is wild that you just
Sponsored.
factor in eviction into your business model in that way. But um, yeah, and so the LLC is really common. It's very rare that if a landlord's big enough, they won't put their name on the taxpayer record. And a lot of times they also won't even put their name on the business filing. They'll just have a lawyer do it. And so what you really need is the recorder of deeds data so that you can look at whose names are on the mortgages and whose names are on the deeds itself. Cook County charges $65,000 for 1 year of recorder of deeds data. And most other cities, some cities will charge $1 million for that because the title insurance companies buy it. And title insurance, that whole industry literally just exists because fraud is an explicit assumption. Whenever you go to buy a property, it's on you to make sure that property is not doesn't have a lien or doesn't have back taxes or that the owner really is who they say it is. And so you pay the title insurance company to check that for you. And so they obviously have an immense amount of money and so they pay for it and so the city charges a ton of money for it. That's what you would need to really get at
The
the
ownership.
true owner. The
Oh,
taxpayer record is a lot of times landlords will just use tax services to do their taxes for them, and so that, of course, those addresses are bunk. Like you can't use those to
Yeah.
make those connections.
Yeah. Here's another one. Do you work on this full time? And then what is the process of getting grant funding to work on this?
Yes, this is my full-time job. I've been working on this full-time since June of 2024 when it started. And grant funding is extremely difficult. We are right now in the process of sort of rethinking the model that we've had so far. And grant funding, basically, when it comes to the nonprofit funding world, you need to have connections and you need to already have money. That's the biggest thing you need. And so I submitted probably like 40 or 50 grant applications, just cold submissions.
Yeah.
Sometimes I would reach out to a program officer, and I was pretty much ignored by, I'd say like outright ignored by probably 50, 60% of them. And then the other 95% or the other do math here, 35, 40% were the rejection letters. But
Yeah.
a kind of rejection letter where it's like, we cannot and will not give you feedback. Do not contact us. Like these foundations do not want people reaching out to them. A lot of times they won't even put contact info on their website. And I imagine it's because they're getting a ton, like everyone wants money, right? Everyone, so many people
Yeah.
make these, they'll found a nonprofit. So there's so much community work going on. There's so much work that needs funding. And so they
Yeah.
definitely do that because they get too many people reaching out to them, but it makes it extremely difficult to get the funding and will leave you, I guess it couldn't be considered a waste of time because there's always the chance, but it ends up costing you a ton of extra time that could be spent building the tool. And so yeah, it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah. How about this? What has the feedback been from like your stakeholders? And they actually also mentioned other like landlords. Have you gotten, well, I guess those are two different questions. So what's feedback been from like stakeholders, like your tenants groups, other tenants, other people that want to use Mapper? And then on the other side, have you gotten any feedback from landlords?
Yeah, feedback from stakeholders. People think it's really useful. And this sort of gets at to why it's such a great opportunity to start it. Like, why doesn't something like this already exist?
Yeah.
I was 2026, but outside of a handful of places, there's beyond the assessor website or the state Secretary of State's business lookup. There are not many places you can go to figure out who your landlord is, especially if they use the trust. Um, and so there's just like the need for this in other places. The biggest feedback we get is when are you coming to our city? When are you going to expand to our city? And of course, also the feedback, the other big feedback from landlords that we've gotten. We've gotten very little feedback from landlords, but the biggest thing is the data's wrong, or rather, my name is incorrectly attributed to a property. And so that happens because this is a massive amount of data being processed. And a lot of times these records are not updated. Like
Yeah.
the city or the county or the state or the county will not update them. And so sometimes names can get incorrectly associated in the networks. And we try to mitigate that using the with the analog research, we can like mark names and addresses to be excluded from the network, but things will slip through the cracks inevitably. And so
Mhm.
we actually created, for that reason, we added this link right here. So if there's a problem with the data, let's say you're a landlord and the data is wrong, you can go to
Yeah.
this link and you can fill out this form, this data rectification request. And so we'll look at this and then go in and make the changes. So this was added to try to, and that's also why we changed the wording a little bit from landlord to portfolio. So with the portfolio, these are just the properties associated with the network. They are not the real true owner. And a lot of times people say, well, okay, well, I came to Landlord Mapper to find the true owner, but you're telling me I can't do that? That's because the nature of the data and the nature of this domain is such that it is
Yeah.
not possible to give that straightforward of an answer unless you're in Minneapolis and you have a rental registry system, which is why it's important that the city of Chicago passes that.
Yes. Okay. What time is it? Okay, I'll ask if anybody in the Zoom land has any last questions before we wrap it up. Not sure. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming, Dylan. It was amazing. It was great to hear your update, and like we hope